Thank you so much for joining us for our seminar this afternoon on Beyond Fit, recruiting a more diverse intern class. This is great timing because you have already matched your next class of interns by the time you view this. You're probably getting ready to welcome them for orientation. And funnily, I think many of us get caught in the trap of approaching recruiting like it's a sprint. We hurry through it, we make the match, and then we take a big sigh of relief, and we don't think about recruiting again until it's time to think about the next class. But in reality, it's much more of an endurance event. Aaron and I on the call here just recently ran an ultra marathon, so even more than a marathon. This was 50 miles. And I can tell you, the approach to recruiting should be much more like that. You know, it's about your preparation, and then it's actually about the event. And when you're in an ultra marathon, I can tell you it's a really long event. And then honestly, with recruiting, you never cross the finish line because you just keep going, and you need to stay focused on this process because you're never finished, you're never done. It's always about recruiting the next class and staying focused on the importance of having it be a diverse class of folks that are going to bring different perspectives. My name is Raj Wolliver. I am the director at the Maine Dartmouth Family Medicine Residency in Augusta, Maine.
Good morning and or afternoon. I'm Leon McCrae II. I am the Family Medicine Residency Program Director at Drexel University College of Medicine and Tower Health Family Medicine Residency Program. I am also the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Drexel University College of Medicine.
Well, hi, I'm Aaron George. I'm a family physician, the Chief Medical Officer at Meritus Health. We're a rural hospital about an hour west of Baltimore, DC in Maryland. And I'm also a core faculty member of a new residency program that has partnered with Raj's program in Maine Dartmouth to help build a new program that is just welcoming our third class this year. And so we've been going through an awful lot of these discussions about how to inspire diversity in a new program as well. Now, for the three of us, we have no specific conflicts of interest to disclose. And when we built this workshop, we realized that STFM would have a 30-minute time limit. But we wanted this to be more than just a unidirectional session. So we'd encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to watch this with your teams. Maybe watch this during a didactic session in which you review your recruiting for the past year, even alongside your residents. We'd recommend this be 60 minutes, and we've built in opportunities throughout where we'd recommend that you'll pause our video and talk about things with your team. So we're going to start just there. Looking around the room, looking around your team, your faculty, your residency, how diverse are you? How far have you come on the pipeline of trying to expand diversity? Is this something that's new? Is this something that you've been working on for a while? And it's a good place to start just to reflect upon your local context first before we start to really move forward. So we'll allow you just a moment, and then Raj will move on to kind of understanding why this really matters.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So why is this important? And, you know, at the top of our list here is that, well, it's now an ACGME requirement. There should be no shame if that's what put this on your radar screen. We do a lot of things to meet requirements. We tend to be goal-driven kind of people. And so if it was the ACGME that's helped you to open your eyes and say, hey, wait a minute, this is something that's important because it matters for my accreditation, then that's fine. That's a great place to start. And it's an important way of making sure this stays on our radar screen. But I'm sure as we look at this more in depth, it is not hard to see that it's about a whole lot more than just meeting the requirements for the ACGME. But maybe they're the ones that helped us to get started. So good on the ACGME from that standpoint. I think it is not hard to figure out why it's important that physician demographics should reflect community demographics. And I have a story that really helps me to think about this. I'm up here in Maine. A few years ago, I had a resident who was of Indian origin. He was from the province of Gujarat in India, and he spoke Gujarati. And I couldn't have told you, honestly, that there was anybody else in the whole state of Maine that spoke Gujarati. But sure enough, it wasn't long before folks figured out, hey, that there's a new doctor in town who happens to speak Gujarati. And I remember one morning in particular when I was precepting him, when literally half of his patients communicated with him in Gujarati. for their medical appointments. And I can tell you, I'm certain that those patients were getting far better care from someone who understood their background, who shared a language and shared some cultural identity than if they were getting that care from me. So it's really important that the demographics of your physicians should look like those of your community. The other thing to keep in mind is that as residency directors and faculty members, we have a lot of control over the pipeline. We are actually the end point. So what it is that we are looking for trickles back up the pipeline and has a significant influence on medical schools and who they choose to accept to their medical school classes that are then desirable candidates for residencies. So the more that we work to make sure that the residents that we select are representative of the patients that they're going to care for, the more medical schools will choose to select applicants to the medical school that are going to help to have successful matches with residencies. We know that more diverse teams perform better. It might sometimes feel more comfortable, in quotes, to have people that have similar ideas that are a good fit. But honestly, we know that different perspectives and people who have different approaches and come from different backgrounds are going to make your team perform better. And so we should all be seeking out a more diverse team so that we have the opportunity to perform at our best. And so that is an important part of our selection process. We know that a more diverse physician workforce promotes health equity. That's certainly very important for our communities, for our patients. And then finally, we know that physician-patient race concordance improves patient satisfaction, patient comprehension, and the continuity of care. To me, those sound like the hallmarks of family medicine. And so we should certainly be seeking the kinds of physicians that are going to be able to connect with our communities, to cement our role as partners with those in our community, and to continue to carry out the core values of family medicine. Leon, tell me about the sweet spot for your residency.
Sweet spot. You know, I love this term sweet spot because any of us who have been in the recruitment game, and I call it a game because it really is a way that we navigate a system and try to figure out the best solution. We all have a place where we feel like we get our residents. You know, when you create your list, when you get your cohort together, and we just recently, based on the taping of this, all just recently completed our rank list and got our new matches. We have a place where folks tend to fall. And, you know, where is it that you normally get your residents? You know, as Aaron primed you when we went into this, take some time and think, do they normally come from a certain state? Do they normally come from a certain school? Do they normally have a certain MCAT score? Do they normally have a certain step 1 score? Do they normally, you know, have a list of activities, ideas, things that make them the type of resident who ends up in your zone? Then the next question is, how diverse is that sweet spot? It's great if we as a cohort of training directors get together and create all these wonderful opportunities and bring folks in. But are applicants who are more diverse actually in your training program sweet spot, in that special place, in that space where you actually pull in residents who are going to end up in your program? And so coming out of this, what was a very unique season for all of us, it made me take a step back and reflect on what were the specific characteristics that mattered to me as a training director. What were the things that I actually valued in a new generation of individuals who are going to be going out and practicing family medicine? And how do we bring those ideas together? And so I think now in terms of creating that sweet spot, thinking about those key characteristics, thinking about how it is that we approach who recruits, who screens, who it is that we decide to interview, what are the touch points? How are we actually picking and putting those things together to create this very unique class? And while I don't want to belabor the point, I do want us to be intentional about figuring out that time and that space for how it is that you create the areas where those folks are going to come together. And Aaron, I'd like to turn it over to you and have you maybe talk to us a bit about what was the approach to recruiting in your space.
Sure. And again, it's a new program. We've had an awful lot of opportunity to really reflect on this purposely. And it's not like we've had the playbook for the last 30 years, as a lot of established programs would say, well, this is the way we've always done it. And then changing that culture can be a challenge. And so approaching this as leaders in your program, it's really important to stop and reflect about every step about what you're doing. Now, I'd love to come back to the analogy that Raj had made at the outset about this being a marathon or an ultra marathon. And we totally recognize that this is a time for recovery, right? We finished the race. We finished our rank list. Now it's time to take a break as academicians in family medicine. But the reality is that this is the time to actually stop and pick up the pace a little bit. And I hate to say that because I know we're all a little bit tired, but this is a great time to debrief. Look back at your last year, especially given that this was a virtual year. How did you approach everything? How did you approach everything from the front end to the back end? And what are you planning to change? What are you willing to change? What are you able to change? So this will be another opportunity for you to just pause with your group right now. And I'd like you to just stop and reflect back over the last 2 years. How have you approached recruiting in a way that inspires diversity, equity, and inclusivity? And I hope if you're in a group, you've had a chance to talk about this a little bit. And I want to come back again to that analogy of the marathon. A lot of the traditional ways to approach to ranking candidates is essentially sprinting the first mile and walking the rest, or waiting to the last mile and sprinting then. So that's either trying to bring in diverse applicants to interview, or waiting until rank day and then trying to prioritize ranking of those applicants that are diverse. But there is so much more than just that little tinkering around the edges of recruiting. And I'd like you to consider, how do you approach your chart review? How do you approach the scores that you apply for applicants? Who gets to look at those applications and what do they get to look at? Do you assign points? And if so, do you have points that are allocated for things that would inspire diversity within your group that may not be traditional academic markers like board scores or passage of step exams? Who gets to look at those and who gets to make the final decision? And going a step beyond, what does your messaging look like? This is really important. It's more than just how we approach the applicants on paper. What are the emails that you're sending? What does your interview day itself actually look like? Are you sending messages of inclusivity? Are you communicating with your applicants that diversity is important to you? Because if you're not, then you may not necessarily be connecting with those applicants in ways that are going to inspire them to want to join your program. Now, when we use the term diversity, I think that applies across the board. Every program approaches this a little bit differently. So sometimes there's the question about, how do I get started from where I am? So Raj, I wonder if you can offer a couple of first steps on how to approach establishing this within your community.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Honestly, this was a wake up for me. I'm up here in Maine. Maine is literally the whitest state in the 50 United States. And so I think I cut myself and our program a break for a long time. I said, we're up here in white Maine. We're not going to be able to attract diversity. This is not going to work. And that wasn't until I actually looked at our demographics. And while it is true for sure that Maine is a very white state, in the state as a whole, it's only about 5% people of color. I also learned that the community that we work in is more like 7 to 8% people of color. And when I started to think about this, my residents were not 7 to 8% people of color. In fact, they were 0% people of color. And so I could keep cutting myself a break and saying it's white Maine. I'm not going to be able to change the demographics of my program. But it wasn't until that I said, hey, my physicians don't look like my community, that we said, this is something important. We need to think about what we can do, even if we start small. Our goal really is to look like our community. So 7 to 8% of my residents should be people of color. And we've been able to accomplish that once we decided that that was important, once we really determined for ourselves that this is what our community looks like. When we looked back at those things that we really know are most important about physician-patient concordance, that is important, that our doctors that we're training look like the communities that we're there to serve. And so your goals may be small, depending on what the demographics of your community are, but that's step one. Figure out, what is my community really? And not just guessing or not just eyeballing it, but what is the makeup of my community? And then do my residents mirror that? Are they similar to that? And that's where you get started. That was an important first step for me to reframe the way I had thought about trying to recruit for diversity. Leon?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts here?
No, I have a lot of thoughts here. I think as you're making this transition, as a person from a diverse background, I'm an African-American man in medicine. I often get the question of what does diversity mean to me, and how do I help to create that in these spaces? And I also want to echo the idea that diversity means lots of things in lots of places. And I think that there are so many factors that you mentioned that contribute to diversity, but I want to take a step back and talk about commonality. You and Raj both talked about the fact that you're ultra marathoners. I do not run ultra marathons. No way, not interested, not at all. But I did run a half marathon. And so I do know an experience of running, but to see me, you may not know that that's a thread that connects us. And so a lot of times we focus on our difference, but not on the things that actually bring us together. And so when I think about considering diversity, we have diversity of life experience. But in all of the people that you're going to see and engage with, there's a lot more commonality than there actually is difference. And I think that sometimes when you think about bringing each other together, then thinking about all of these discrete points that make us different or pull us apart. And so what are those factors when I think about your program, Raj, or your program, Aaron, or mine? We have to look at our communities and figure out what diversity means in that space. Diversity might mean gender diversity. It may mean sexual identity diversity. It may mean diversity of zip codes. It might mean diversity of schools. So when you think about the demographics of the patients that you're serving in your individual cohorts, you want to look at all of your local data, your state data, your regional data, so that you can make sure that you are actually trying to create individuals that serve those communities. You should also, though, look at the service history of many of the applicants that you're bringing in, because they may have a history of service to those communities that might not represent what they look like demographically on paper. Raj, you mentioned that you were from, quote unquote, the whitest state in the country. So it means that when someone comes to your program, they might be a first, they might be an only, and they might be a different. And what does that mean? And what does it mean to support someone in that space? And I love that you have created that concept in your recruitment process where you take a step back and say, is this someone who is going to create something in our space that we have not seen before? And will that add to the richness of who we are as a program? Understanding, though, that if you are a first and only or a different, there could be unique challenges associated with that and trying to create an inclusive environment. And then we talk about fit. And this was really a unique year in this virtual season about fit, because oftentimes we bring people into our place and we hang out with them. We're like, oh my gosh, that seems like a Maine resident. Oh my God, that seems like a Meredith Health resident. Oh my gosh, that's a total Drexel Family Medicine resident. Like I feel them, like they came in, they're just part of us. And so we create all of these biases related to who we think fits based on what we think we attract. And you mentioned it promotes sameness. It limits inclusion of new perspectives. We decrease the opportunity to have high quality new ideas. And it actually stops us from being able to grow and develop. And I think that those are essential components, because we have to take a step back and realize that we have to look at diversity through a very distinct and different lens. And so now the challenge is, what do we do about it? We've done a lot of talking, gentlemen. And now folks are listening and saying, yeah, you've told us all the stuff. We know the problem. It's like someone talking to us about, fatigue and residency, or like, trying to get more sleep. It's like, yeah, we'll change the work hours and then maybe I'll get a rest. In this way, it's like, so how are we going to increase diversity? So the first thing that I say to everybody is, it has to be a priority. Is it in your mission? Are you overt and unapologetic about the fact that diversity matters to you? If you don't take a forward and affirmative stance about it being important, then that won't permeate your program. And sometimes that is not always going to be popular. And you have to be comfortable setting down and laying a foundation for diversity to be a thing that matters in your space. Second, look at your recruitment patterns. How many applicants do you interview? Do you interview that number because of convenience? Do you interview that number of applicants because it's all the individuals that you get? Is it because you may not have recruited as far and wide? Are you traveling and going to places where more diverse applicants are so that they can come into your space? What we did in my program was when I arrived at Drexel now 6 years ago, we used to interview approximately 70 applicants a year for 7 slots. I actually doubled that to about 130 or 140 normally. And this year I interviewed 160. Now, that meant more work for my faculty. That meant even more applications to review, but it also meant we got to look at more people. And it's amazing the number of individuals that I've either met on the recruitment trail or folks that I gave an opportunity to and said, well, you know what? I read that application. That person has a really unique story. Let's bring them in. And then they make an amazing resident in my program. I'm not saying change who you are, but I am saying keep those things going where they're going. And so with that, I'm going to push this over to my colleague, Aaron, for you to tell me about how is it that you want to change your approach?
So one more opportunity to pause. We've talked a little bit and inspired you in your groups, hopefully, to talk about what your diversity looks like. We've asked you to consider a little bit about what you've done. And I want to encourage you to take a couple of minutes now and ask you, before we interject a little bit more, what do you want to do? What is your vision for your program based upon who your team is, where you are, and where you want to go? So just take a moment to talk a little bit about the things that you think you could do to inspire diversity in your home team. We do believe that there's a lot of approaches to this, and I want to come back to that mentality of more than just tinkering around the edges. If you make one change this year and one change next year, this is going to take you an awful long time to get to where you want to be. This really is about fundamentally sitting down. And again, right now is a perfect time. Bring in a couple of your residents, some of your faculty members, maybe even consider bringing in someone from your administration so they can see that your commitment to this is sincere. And have a conversation about what you want to do, what needs to be done, where the gaps exist. We can talk a little bit about that. Again, coming back to the application review itself. There are actually many programs around the country that are now starting to blind individual parts of the application. Certainly maybe the picture, sometimes even the name, the race, or the board scores. Have you thought as your own program about putting a lens through where you blind all the board scores and academics and focus solely on the individual and what they would represent in bringing themselves to your program? It certainly would change your applicant pool next year if you chose to blind board scores completely. Now, you can still set some minimum cutoffs and then blind beyond that if you'd like, just to maintain certain thresholds. But ultimately, there are a lot of programs that are moving beyond academics as the defining feature for their thresholds. And again, this is about the right people that inspire diversity, not those that just fit in based upon the traditional metrics you've used in the past. And then who's involved? I mean, really thinking about who is doing that first and second pass, who's looking at applications that are borderline. You know, sure, maybe you have 50% that you review that you know for sure you want to bring them in. But if you looked at that gray area, and rather than having one person look at it, could you have a committee that says, let's take a second lens and review these last trickle, maybe 50% of your applicants, to identify those that may bring a diverse edge to your team. And this goes beyond just the application review and interview process itself. You got to look at your local pipeline. Have you looked into the college? Have you looked into high school? Have you looked into some of the local medical schools? You know, a lot of inventive programs are attaching themselves to FMIGs, to SNMAs, other local collegiate groups, and encouraging bringing them along. Because along that pipeline, you might be able to inspire diversity in the messaging that you have today that brings an applicant 5 years down the road to your program in a way that otherwise you would never be able to do if you only focused on those that were specifically applying to your program itself. And lastly, I want you to consider what you put out there. What is the perception? Think about what applicants are getting when they connect with you. Are they seeing a homogeneous faculty that is showing favoritism to those that look similar and have that fit? Or during your interview day, at the point of your front desk staff welcoming applicants, are they welcoming with eagerness and encouraging inclusivity and welcoming? Do you have a purposeful, maybe 20-minute discussion from a faculty member on the importance of diversity in your program and how you build it into your curriculum and your culture? And those are ways to change the paradigm with which applicants view you. Because after all, remember, if a diverse applicant, if somebody that comes in is that first only different, they have to feel that they fit in, and there needs to be mentorship and protection so that they can feel secure in those roles. So I do want you to think a little bit about this. And I'd also like to encourage, maybe Raj, you can offer a couple more things about that environment. What are the things that you've done locally and that others can do to really inspire that culture of inclusivity?
Yeah, I guess I would just encourage us all to sort of engage in a little conversation here as we think about how we create the culture, how we can create the environment. Because as we've alluded to with our running metaphor, this is a long endurance event, right? First step is thinking about recruiting. That's the sprint. But really the longer term part is how do you create a culture where you really not only attract, but retain providers of diverse backgrounds. Thinking about the first only different is only a place to get started, but creating an environment that's open and inclusive will be a way to make sure that you retain those physicians to continue to care for their community over the long haul. And I think moving away from things like board scores, gosh, board scores are the last thing in my mind that are predictive of how someone actually performs as a physician. They are reflective of how someone performs on a standardized test, period. How they show up to serve their communities and take great care of their patients is not reflected in any board score I've ever seen. You have thoughts to add on some of these ideas, Leon?
Absolutely. I always have thoughts, Raj. Can't give me the mic. But in truth, I love the idea of the concept of the holistic review, but I want to talk about what it's like when you get to the place. Because I think it's one thing to recruit folks. I think it's another to create an environment that is comfortable when folks get there. And I think that part of that is open and honest conversations about what it means to be who people are. I think it's also about actively doing the work in those community spaces, wherever those communities are. Because if you commit in your programs to work and service, you will attract folks who want to do service to underrepresented communities or service to communities who are financially disenfranchised. Those are the things that matter. If you have open and honest conversations about diversity and why diverse teams work better, then you're going to recruit individuals who believe and buy into diversity as an important concept. But most importantly, when I think about this, this is about, and you mentioned it before, creating that true concordance between physician and patient, where you have some degree of tie that binds, some similar characteristic that allows you to make a connection so that you can improve the health outcomes of the patients that we take care of. And that's what I always bring it back to, is that ultimately it's about us training individuals who are going to serve those communities. And it's our job as training directors to make that environment as diverse and as inclusive as possible. And I'll turn it over back to both of you in terms of any other closing thoughts.
I like what you had to say there, Leon. I think it's about everything that we do and teach. We're fortunate to be in academic environments where we have time to think and reflect and teach. And so we need to think about how we better include this as a part of our curriculum. It's not just about bringing folks in, but changing the way that we think and approach this as a group, as a organization, as a culture.
Absolutely. Aaron, any other thoughts?
And just knowing that this will be a work in progress. There is no finish line to the marathon, and that is okay because you can enjoy the journey. This is evolving. And just when you start to build diversity in one direction, you may look at your class 5 years down the road and say, well, that's our new homogenous group, and we've got to start to expand and look in other directions. So just being aware that this is evolving, that it's a conversation, and it's about creating a culture that is best for your patients in your community, and you can't go wrong if you're focused on this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.